Dr. Tim Williams, our first speaker. I will introduce him in English so that he can make sure that I miss no crucial detail in his biography, which is quite impressive. Tim has worked at the quartet since January 2010. He leads on the office's efforts to improve the movement of people and goods within the West Bank, between the West Bank and other territories, and in and out of Gaza. This includes aspects of governance, the technical aspects of logistics, and the wider reach of trade facilitation approaches. Before joining the quartet, Tim worked with Doctors Without Borders and in several UN agencies on access issues. He has also worked as a clinical psychologist in New Zealand and with refugees in Thailand. Tim, please, the floor is yours. Tim will, of course, speak in English.
I apologize that my Hebrew is not better, but my Hebrew is the kind of Hebrew you need to get through checkpoints rather than to have a formal discussion on something as important as this. Very briefly, the mandate of the Office of the Quartet Representative is not, as some people think, the political negotiation. The mandate of the Office of the Quartet Representative, or the Quartet Representative and thus our office, is about economic reconstruction and redevelopment in the Palestinian territory, which should occur in parallel with and support the political process. But that's why we're here. I just want to be clear on that. So GDP growth in Gaza in the last 20 years has been 2%. I don't mean 2% per annum, per year, 2% in 20 years. Okay, 2% in 20 years, GDP growth. In that time, the population's grown around 70%, so you can do the math on what that means for per capita GDP. And now around 50% of the population are youth and children. Currently, various organizations cite the unemployment rate at around 60%, but you see figures less than that, figures more than that. The reality is nobody knows the exact number, but the unemployment rate is very, very high. Probably, if you think of Gaza as a single economic entity, the unemployment rate is probably one of the highest in the world, if not the highest. So the subject of this morning is reconstruction in Gaza, and it's not reconstruction in following the tragic conflict of last year, or of the two conflicts before, or of the Hamas-Fatah conflict in 2007. It's actually a necessary physical rebuild, which is necessary. It's about economic redevelopment, and it's about social reconstruction, because the last 20 years have had a very damaging effect in all of those areas. So briefly, just what's happening currently, you would have heard of, many of you, or most of you have heard of the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism, the GRM. Some people call it the GRIM, which was perhaps not the best term to use. This was a trilaterally negotiated mechanism for getting reconstruction material into Gaza, negotiated between the government of Israel, the United Nations, and the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, to ensure that people who needed material for their houses to repair them or to rebuild them, and businesses that needed material to rebuild their businesses, and also public infrastructure projects would get the necessary material. It was difficult to negotiate. There is a lot of risk management involved from the point of view of the government of Israel, but it is operating. Something like more than 60,000 beneficiary families now have materials to repair their homes. No homes have been rebuilt. A number of businesses are now in the construction of repair and rebuild. And I should say at the same time, projects sponsored directly by the UN and other international organizations are still underway. The capacity to get these materials into Gaza at Kerem Shalom is up to the present demand, and the Ministry of Defense, through the Crossing Point Administration, and the Palestinian Authority on the Gaza side, it's a tricky thing for them to do, but have further plans for development that will expand the capacity further. So in the very short term, there's some rebuild underway. There are problems with funding. There are problems with the slowness by which projects are being approved, and a certain amount of the responsibility for that rests with the PA. But the immediate rebuild is beginning to happen, but there's much to be done in terms of public infrastructure. So how did we get to this point where Gaza has a GDP growth over 20 years of 2%, 0.1% a year? I'll start by saying that I think a number of the neighbours of Gaza have actually had a policy of isolating Gaza. That's no news to you, you know that. I would hold that the practice of isolating Gaza has not helped with the security of Egypt, one of the states which has worked very hard to isolate Gaza of late, nor has it helped the security of Israel. And now it is damaging the PA. So you think of the Palestinian population as a culture of deference to political leaders. And President Abbas has been rating more than 50% popularity for years. In very recent polls, his popularity was 36%. So it's also threatening the position of President Abbas, the PA, which threatens the security of any countries that neighbour the West Bank as well. It's an issue. If any of you disagree with that analysis, I'm happy to talk about it later in our discussion period or after. There was a period when Gaza's economy kind of thrived, and that was during the tunnels period. So when Gaza was the least isolated for inputs because 2,000 to 4,000 tonnes of aggregate were coming through the tunnels every day. About 400 tonnes of building steel were coming through the tunnels every day. Hamas was taxing that and making quite a profit on building materials and cigarettes. Concern for the health of the people of Gaza, no doubt. And especially during the Morsi year, from June 2012 to July 2013, Gaza did well in a very shallow economic way. There was no investment in the economy, but the construction and reconstruction was going on and money was being made. But the tunnels period created a network of tribes and criminal gangs in the Sinai with links probably all the way to Morocco, which had a further, they were empowered by the money they made, and it had a further impact on the present security situation in the Sinai. Now, when I say isolated, there have been access improvements by the government of Israel in the last few years. A classic example being the so-called negative list of banned goods that was instituted by the cabinet decision in 2010 after the flotilla incident, but they have been insufficient. Current exports out of Gaza are 0.2% of imports. It's a little bit unbalanced. So the solution requires significant changes in practice. And Egypt and Israel have a right to control and to manage their borders. That's a given. But I'm using both those words, control and manage. You control a border by ensuring that nobody crosses, no goods or people cross where and when you don't want them to. And you manage a border by managing the crossings in a way which is good for the security of Egypt, Israel, or whatever other country. I actually come from a country with no land borders at all, and our nearest neighbour is 3,000 kilometres away, so this is new to me, well, a little bit. But you control a border by protecting it, and you manage it by ensuring that there is movement of people and movement of goods. And I would say it's in the interest of both Israel and Egypt that border management allows for the full reconstruction of Gaza. Physical rebuild, economic redevelopment, social reconstruction. And the responsibility is not only with the government of Israel and Egypt, but also with the Palestinian Authority, who has a lot of work to do simply within Palestinian bureaucracy to ensure that the ability of businesses to operate is there. So, for example, and I think you can lay the responsibility of this for where you like, but just to give you one example of what goes on, a Palestinian firm that wants to export a container will spend $1,750 US to do that, and it will take 23 days. An Israeli firm, it will cost them $620, and it will take 10 days. For a company in Gaza, there's not only the $1,750, but there's the additional cost of importing goods at Kerem Shalom, which costs 1,200 shekels a truckload, and similarly when their goods come out. And when the goods come out on pallets, not in containers, they need to pay another $300 or $400 to have the container loaded at the port. So it gives you an idea. And similarly for import, a typical Palestinian firm will pay $1,425 to import a container. It will take them on average 38 days. An Israeli company, $565, 10 days max, 10 days average. For a Gazan company, add on those costs. So simply operating a business in Gaza, and there are some very smart, very likable, very sensible business people in Gaza. Some of you will have met them. They are running an uphill struggle in order to run a business in Gaza. You'll notice that I didn't use the term which many people have mentioned called lifting the siege. I think it's not a helpful term. It's like an apple pie term. It sounds very good but means nothing. So the solution lies, and I am very aware of time and my fellow speakers, the solution lies in physical reconstruction, construction of housing through better access to materials, rebuild of buildings, and for those of you who are very familiar with Operation Cast Lead, there was a huge amount of destruction of factories and other commercial enterprises in that conflict. The more recent conflict didn't have economic targets so high on the target list. Public infrastructure, particularly water and energy, and it's not only production of those things, it's not only the power plant and a desalination plant, it's the network necessary to distribute water and electricity effectively and to collect wastewater and treat it to a high standard, and reconstruction in agriculture. In economic reconstruction, it's not only how goods are moved across the crossings, but having reliable and transparent processes. So 3 weeks ago, people in Gaza were importing solar panels. 3 weeks ago, 3 shiploads of solar panels were confiscated. Nobody knows why, where, how, but they didn't come across. So the businesses had invested money in importing those solar panels. Now they're gone. So the process needs to be reliable and needs to be transparent. There needs to be access to markets, both import and export. And people talk about the traditional Gazan markets as being the West Bank and Israel. They're not traditional because they're traditional. They're traditional because they are the best complementary markets. When you have a population who have okay skills, relatively low wage rates, you need a proximate market to deal with. And it's good for Israeli businesses, for instance in the garment business, to have a very quick response time for short, small runs of specialized clothing. And Gaza can do that. So it's not just Gaza business that benefits, it's Israeli business as well. And the Palestinian Authority has much to do with recovering VAT, with transparency of their own processes, with investment promotion. The last one that I mentioned is social redevelopment, and that's movement of people for education, movement of people for social contact, and one example is education. When you isolate a territory, in this case, and you create an educational vacuum, i.e. students cannot travel from Gaza to, say, a West Bank university to learn about whatever it may be, and Celine can tell you much about that, you create an educational vacuum. And people will fill that educational vacuum. And the kind of education that people then get may not be the kind of education that you necessarily want them to get. So isolation creates vacuums, and vacuums are filled, and the educational vacuum is simply one of those. And the last point I'd make, which is social and economic, is the need for effective government. And clearly that's very difficult for the Palestinian Authority right now. The relationship with Hamas is not good, if I put it politely. But political constraints on the Palestinian side have to be overcome to ensure that there are effective means of government for all of the things that I've talked about. I will stop there, and I've taken more than my 10 minutes. I apologise to my colleagues, and I look forward to our discussion.